We're about to begin our final closing session of the day, which is an introduction to social entrepreneurship, opportunities, challenges, trends. Our expert speaker today is going to be Marcos Salazar, who you may know as the executive director of Be Social Change, which is a great organization, the largest social impact community and professional development hub in New York. Marcos has a very impressive resume on him. He's previously worked in research for the American Psychological Association and for the Girl Scouts of the USA, and he has served as vice president of programs for the White House Project as well. And now he has used all of his prior experience to create Be Social Change and work on educating and connecting the next generation of purpose-driven professionals. And he is a great expert on social enterprise in all of the many forms it may take, and he's going to tell you a little bit about it. I will turn it over to him.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everybody. Oh, can you hear me? Good. Marcos Salazar, Executive Director and co-founder of Be Social Change. I also do career and business coaching to help early stage startups as entrepreneurs build their organizations. So this is one of my favorite classes to teach. Just as I set up the class, there's going to be a lot of content. I talk a little fast, but if anybody has any questions, I prefer not to just necessarily be me speaking at you all. If you have any questions, if you need any clarification on something, feel free to raise your hand. We're going to have Q&A definitely at the end, but there's a lot of really interesting things that we're going to be covering. So what we're going to be talking about is really the evolution of social entrepreneurship, why it's become so popular, and then we're actually going to go through a lot of different types of organizations and case studies so you can get a sense of the new types of hybrid organizations and the methodologies that people are using to grow for-profit, socially driven organizations as well as nonprofits. And then I'll talk a little bit about how my own personal journey and how I came to build Be Social Change on that social entrepreneurship path. So before I get started, I'd love to get a sense of who's in the crowd. So how many people work for nonprofits? Cool. How many people work for a social enterprise or for-profit organization? And for-profit organization? Good. How many people are thinking of starting a nonprofit or social enterprise? Perfect. So this will give you foundational pieces as well as a framework to think about social entrepreneurship moving forward. So as Tracy mentioned, our mission is to help people build purpose-driven careers, businesses, and lives. So over the past 3 years, we've become the largest social impact community in New York City. When we talk about social impact, it's not only the nonprofit sector, but public sector, the social innovation, social entrepreneurship space that we're going to be talking about, as well as one of our biggest growing demographics are what I call social good explorers. Those people that are looking to plug in but don't quite know how. They've had a for-profit career for a long time, and they want to transition into the nonprofit space. They want to apply their talents and skills to create impact. So we create a space to be able to do that. And we do that in 3 core ways: through education, events, and resources. So from an education standpoint, we host anywhere from 15 to 20 classes every week focused on helping people build the core foundational skills and mindsets they need to build a purpose-driven career or business. So that's anything from design thinking to coaching to facilitation to management to storytelling to lean startup, which we're going to talk about in a bit. Core skills that we think every purpose-driven professional needs to grow their career and scale their impact. We also do capacity building workshops and internal trainings for nonprofits. We teach entrepreneurship and innovation workshops to have nonprofits become much more entrepreneurial. We're also doing management workshops to help nonprofits transition into much more 21st century management, agile, relationship-focused management style. We're also going to be doing 2-day workshops for management in the 21st century early next year. And then again, coaching and training. We also do consulting for Fortune 500 companies to help them become more sustainable or socially conscious. When it comes to events, we have monthly networking events, panel events, as well as firesides. Our main event, one of our signature series is called The Future Of. So we've done stuff on the future of corporate social responsibility, future of work. Next year we're doing a year-long series on the future of New York, the future of social good tech, future of fundraising, future of philanthropy. And those are focused on bringing the most innovative social innovators, entrepreneurs, and founders to share their stories and their expertise so people can learn about what's happening in a particular sector within the social impact space. I do fireside chats in a Charlie Rose style fashion, interviewing founders of large organizations. So we've done stuff with B Corp, which we're going to talk about. I interviewed the founder of Kind, Nancy Loveland, the CEO of Do Something, and founder of Crisis Text Line. So really getting deep, not only in terms of how the organization was built, but the personalities and the stories behind that. And then we do networking events on a monthly basis, large networking events as well as curated networking events for the nonprofit sector. We've done next week we're doing one on a networking event mixer for executives and directors. We have an HR and operations circle, a marketing circle. So those are monthly networking events to help people that normally don't get to bump shoulders connect. And then we build out resources to build out infrastructure in the social impact space. One is we have a Be Social Change guide that curates all the social good events in New York City. So every Monday we map out everything that's happening in the social impact space for weeks ahead. So it's your one go-to place to figure out what's happening in the nonprofit and social innovation space. So overall, one of the things we're trying to do, similar to the Foundation Center, is really building out core infrastructure and connective tissue within the social innovation space, so people can plug in independent of where they're at, whether they're a startup, a builder, whether they're an impact amplifier, so those working within organizations where they're creative, whether they're just exploring. We try to create pathways so people can plug in to make the world a better place. But the way that we also do it, and one of the core foundational pieces, especially within the emerging social entrepreneurship space, is we believe that scale equals partnerships. So in terms of all the classes and all the events and everything that we do, I don't teach all the classes. We have about, so far over the past couple of years, we've probably taught about 50 plus different courses. So what we do is we're essentially a platform. We have space partners, we have outreach partners, and what we do is our mission is helping unlock human and social capital in New York City. So for example, our instructors, we have about 35 different instructors all over New York City, all within different organizations, and they have amazing knowledge and expertise that stays in their head. And what we do is we try to unlock it by creating a platform for those people to share it. So if you're an instructor for Be Social Change, we take care of logistics, we take care of marketing, we take care of space, and you just show up and deliver awesome content. And that's how we end up scaling. We also partner with amazing organizations like the Foundation Center, Taproot, all these different organizations to share their opportunities with our community as well as share our opportunities with their community. So how do we end up really collaborating and thinking and moving away from a scarcity mindset to a much more abundance mindset, where the pie is not fixed, which is typically seen in the nonprofit sector, and that we can actually all grow it together. So when we think about our partners, we think about how can we grow your community and how can you help us grow ours. So it's really at the core of Be Social Change. Collaboration is one of our central tenets. So we're here for social entrepreneurship, but before we get started, I want to just get people's understanding of what they think about social entrepreneurship, but more importantly, entrepreneurship as they're here in the room. So raise your hand as and just answer and just shout something out. What comes to mind when you hear the word entrepreneurship? You don't have to be shy. Come on, yeah. Startups, right? What else? What else? Entrepreneurship. Words, phrases. Donald Trump. Interesting. Yeah. Business, yes. Innovation. Hard work. What else? Lean? Lean, good. Leadership. What else? Initiative. Head of a social curve. Risk. We're actually going to talk about that, which is a common thing. And if you're a good entrepreneur and if you take risks, you're actually a very bad entrepreneur, which is the opposite of the mindset that people think about. What else? Change? Self-improvement. Cool. Great. So then when you hear the word social entrepreneurship, what comes to mind? Social entrepreneurship, yeah. Using that skill to change society as a whole, yeah? Transformation, or maybe transformational change. What else? Non-for-profit? Social media? What else? The Koch brothers? Interesting. I'd argue very vehemently against that. Self-sustainability? Nonprofit and for-profit sharing. What? The social life and community. And stakeholders and paybacks and cash. Yep. Yes. And one more. Exactly. Exactly. Good. So the reason I asked that question is that one, sometimes entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship can be a bit ambiguous. We're going to talk about that and get clarification. And then the second piece is that when I think about entrepreneurship, it's an augmentation. Social entrepreneurship, it's an augmentation of entrepreneurship. So we're still utilizing the entrepreneurial principles, but we're applying it, like you all said, to a different path or a different purpose. The other side is when you think about it, there were two ways that we talked about entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurship. One was the process or the business. So startups, building a business, and that's that external piece. But then there's the internal piece, which is maybe risk taking, maybe creative, maybe innovative. Those are those individual characteristics. So you think about the individual, the actual social entrepreneur, and then the actual process or the business. And we'll talk about all about that, but just wanted to get a sense of what people thought about that. So just quickly, a little bit of my social entrepreneurship journey. And Tracy ended up talking about this before. So I've led this double life. Where by day I was a non-profiteer. So I got a degree in psychology, studied neuroscience, and then a master's in organizational management, and then was a certified leadership coach. So after I graduated college, I worked at a mental health clinic, thought I was going to become a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, get a PhD, do some research, have some clients, and have this nice little, very simple life. And then I dived into entrepreneurship, and that complicated things. So I worked for the mental health clinic and then moved to the American Psychological Association, where I did psychology, research on education workforce trends within psychology, so not clinical, more data and analysis. Then moved to Girl Scouts, where I did leadership research. I came in to do leadership research and measure the impact of the Girl Scout leadership program. Then moved on, and I was a tech person in New Tech, so moved into an additional role of a tech strategist and helped build a technology strategy for the Girl Scout movement. I'm an official Girl Scout, or was an official Girl Scout. Candlelight ceremony, promised to be a sister to all my sisters. Had as many Thin Mints or Samoas as I could ever want. So when you're rolling in at a party with 10 boxes of Thin Mints in non-Girl Scout cookie season, you're usually the most popular person. And then moved on to a women's leadership organization called the White House Project. Which was one of the most fundamental and core nonprofits to help more women run for office as well as rise within the corporate sector. So did that by day. And then by night, I was just building lots of stuff. Didn't know what the word was until I had a friend tell me, you're just an entrepreneur. So I had written a couple books, last one on the psychology of life after college called The Turbulent 20 Survival Guide. Opened up a couple clothing companies, was a spinning instructor, was a personal trainer, launched a lot of startups that completely, utterly, totally failed. Little bit. And wrote a number of books that never saw the light of day. And I was just building and exploring, very millennial driven, but I didn't know what it was. I just knew that I loved creating, and I realized that was an entrepreneur. But what I realized as I was building Be Social Change is so many of the mistakes that I made, so many of the tens of thousands of dollars that I wasted could have been prevented if I just understood a better strategy and methodology for building a startup. And that's actually what we're going to go over. And that's one of the core things that I want to leave you with. So Be Social Change really came about because I was at Girl Scouts. I was hearing all this stuff, social entrepreneurship, social innovation. This was in 2010. Went out to New York City, and there really wasn't anything from events or education or community. There just didn't exist. There were awesome organizations like the Foundation Center and Taproot that were really working with nonprofits, but nothing in the social entrepreneurship space. So like a typical entrepreneur, I just said, it doesn't exist, I'm going to build it. So launched on Meetup, and it was Be Social Change was a Meetup group. We launched one in New York, and then have a couple co-founders in San Francisco, outside of San Francisco, Mountain View. We launched at the same time. And for some reason in New York, it just took off. And the branding was, we're wanting to bring together educators, nonprofiteers, techies, designers, public sector employees. And then there was this one piece of language that was really significant, which is the do and want to do gooders. Those people that were wanting to explore and grow their career in the impact space but didn't know how. So Meetup called us into their offices within 3 days because so many people were joining. It was just crazy. And just started with regular meetups, just bringing people together, really trying to get a sense of what people wanted. And they're like, okay, I want to learn about this piece. I want to learn about this part of the sector, this area. So that's where events started coming into play. Launched some events and quickly realized we could pack people in the room, 100, 200-person events. So we started doing that for about a year. And then we started realizing people kept coming and saying, okay, I have all these ideas. How do I make them real? And that's where this educational piece came into play. So I was really passionate about social entrepreneurship, helped with and worked with a couple of people to build out a social entrepreneurship curriculum where we'd offer classes on how to build a startup. Launched it about a year and a half, launched it with a lot of fanfare. Realized it totally failed. There is what we found is an interesting trend, there's no market for social entrepreneurship education in the way that we ended up doing it. Not many people were showing up for the classes. I mean, there were some, but not enough for this to be sustainable. But what we did find is that people were coming for the career development classes, for those individual skill building classes. I teach a Your Life on Purpose class. I teach a Networking with Purpose class. I teach a personal branding class, design thinking, public speaking. Those were the classes that people were coming to. So we ended up pivoting and shifting to focus much more on career building versus social entrepreneurship. The other is that there's a much smaller market and much smaller number of people that are wanting to start organizations. So that's how we've shifted and evolved, essentially to become one of the central communities in New York City. We get asked to create Be Social Change hubs all over the world. I was just in Seattle and Portland, and the people I met was like, when are you coming here? You had stuff from Barcelona, from Mexico City. And one of the things we're doing is we're not, and this is always the thing with scale. We think about a nonprofit sector, scale, grow. And the thing is, we're going to go super, super deep in New York City. We want to make sure that our model is fully tested, that it's fully automated, that it's as efficient as possible before we go anywhere else. So Be Social Change is going to be very New York specific and really focusing not only on building out that key infrastructure, but also as a model that then we can use in other cities. So before we get into social entrepreneurship, I think it's extremely important and fundamental to start with entrepreneurship and give a little bit of a history. So entrepreneurship has been around for millennia. And the reason why is like at our core, we are all entrepreneurs. Progress, that was typically the way we thought about it. But now there's social and environmental and other ways of progress and finding new and better ways of doing things. So it's not just new, but it's better. It's improving upon those that already exist. So it's a kind of slight difference that people make this comparison is someone that's building a startup versus someone that's opening up a small business that already has, like a franchise, that already has an existing model and customer base and an understanding of the market. When we think about a startup, we think about more entrepreneur more in those sense. It's not to say that they're not using entrepreneurial skills, but we think about a startup as something that's unknown and different. So that was in the 1800s. A little bit later, Joseph Schumpeter, he started writing it about entrepreneurs more. And he said entrepreneurial profit is the expression of values of what entrepreneurs contribute to production. But in this case now it's changing, not just to production, but to social value, to environmental value. But the thing that Joseph is really known for is this concept called creative destruction. So when you are building something and you're building upon it and you're improving upon it, it's new and it's better, you are destroying something in the marketplace in the process. So think about newspapers, and some of the core revenue of newspapers was classifieds. And then this website called Craigslist comes along and completely levels the entire newspaper industry, right? A free, very low cost, but extremely effective way of people being able to exchange goods and services. Same thing happened with eBay, because upended the advertising industry. Google did this with tons of search engines that were much more hierarchical based, and just completely level those off. So, and this happens in the nonprofit sector. I'm starting to see this a lot in the nonprofit sector. Younger, innovative nonprofits displacing very traditional nonprofits. One example is DoSomething.org. So DoSomething.org engages youth to through campaigns and able to take and motivates them to take action on a number of different issues. I think they're about 20 years old or so, around that time frame. Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts have been around for over 100 years. do something eclipse them as the #1 youth serving organization in the world. They engage more youth than Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. So there is this effective, innovative, lean way that nonprofits are displacing those organizations. Now, Girl Scouts has been in trouble for the past few years financially in a number of other ways. And that's really because there's all these other, there's another awesome organization, She's the First, that sends girls in developing countries to graduate, to be the first to graduate in their family. They engage youth and college students and younger students in such an effective way using social media, and those are the organizations that are displacing other traditional nonprofits. But I think this is the most significant part of why entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship has taken off. So social entrepreneurship in many ways has been around as well, but it's riding on the coattails and leveraging the wave of entrepreneurship that really took place within the tech sector. So why is entrepreneurship so prevalent today? So first, startup costs are much, much lower. So to build a business, it is infinitely cheaper than it was 15, 20, hundreds of years ago. In the past, you had to have capital to start a business. Manufacturing plant, if you were producing products, it required a lot of capital and a lot of financial as well as physical capital. Whereas today, you can open up an online business. If you're building a website, something that costs $10,000, $20,000 to build costs, it's free, or $795 a month to build a website that took that cost $10,000, $20,000 years ago. So startup costs are much lower. Customer acquisition or reaching audiences is infinitely easier. So you ended up mentioning social media. There's free email marketing tools that allow you to reach audiences. In the past, direct marketing, mailing, TV, radio ads, magazines. Like, when was the last time you got a magazine, one of those Sears catalogs in the mail? They just don't exist, right? You just do everything, send it in a PDF. So being able to reach audiences is so much easier, simpler, and cheaper. But being able to engage with them as well. There's SurveyMonkey. There's different surveys that you can end up getting information from your potential customers or people that you serve. And now there's access to capital that's much easier. So in the past, you had to get lots of capital to build an organization. Whereas now there's actually a model and a path. So in the startup sector, and we'll talk later on about how this isn't the case in the social entrepreneurship space as much, is that you have an idea, you build out a website, you build something, a prototype. For $10,000, you raise that from credit cards, from friends and family, and then you start growing and then getting a lot of customers. Then you can raise money from what are called angel investors. So those are those angel investors that are willing to put in $10, $15, $25, $30, $50,000. You get 5 to 10 of those, and you can raise $250,000 to $500,000. Because the cost of startups are much lower, that can be runway for an extended period of time. Then you're growing, you're gaining momentum, getting more customers, and then you go to what are called venture capitalists, they'll give you a Series A or Series B, meaning $1 to $4 million, if not more, to grow. And then the end goal for many startups is sell to Google or Facebook for millions and billions of dollars, right? So there is that pathway. And again, the angel investors is really interesting because in the past, they would have to pony up $250,000, $500,000. Whereas now they can make these little bets, right? Startups have a 90+% failure rate over 5 years. But one of those is going to pop. There's a guy, Chris Sacca, who is the main investor in Twitter. He invested, he got a bunch of credit cards and was able to invest $20,000 or $25,000 in Twitter. Realized it grew, and then he just kept putting in more and more and more. But he's invested in tons of startups that totally failed and lost money. But Twitter IPO'd, and he is worth billions and billions of dollars because he was able to place that little bet. But this, I think, is one of the more significant parts that I think is vital for social entrepreneurship, is that entrepreneurship is developing its own management science. And this is called the lean startup. There's other ones to think about it. There's agile, there's design thinking. I think about lean startup as one of those core models. How many people have heard of lean startup? Read the book? Cool. And we'll talk a little bit about it because the book gives a really good overview, but it's not as good in terms of actually putting it into action, into play. So this, I think, is the most significant part of the book. So Eric Ries wrote the book, The Lean Startup. He was a student of this man, Steve Blank, who's the founder of what we're going to talk about, called customer development, which I think is core to every it's the core building block of every startup. But this, I think, is the biggest and most important thing that he talks about in his book. Startup success can be engineered by following the right process, which means it can be learned, which means it can be taught. So when it comes to leadership, when it comes to management, others, and entrepreneurship, some people think leaders are made. And it's not to say that there are biological and influences in our upbringing that may give us an advantage to success or increase the likelihood of success, but it's really about following a process. And this didn't really exist. And that's where that risk came into play, right? You would build a business and it was high risk and you weren't sure what was going to happen. But if you follow the right process, you can increase the likelihood of success. So the reason why Lean really came about is Eric was working on a startup. He was building a product, and they spent 6 months of development, a tech product, 6 months of development, put it out to the users, and found out that they only used 10 to 15%, very small percentage of the features. So they wasted what happens with that 85%. And he thought to himself, why can't we build something and we know that 15% right off the bat? Versus spending time and energy and resources having to build this huge thing that only people are going to use a small part. And that's where really Lean Startup came into play. So when I think about entrepreneurship, it is the boring stuff. It is about management. It is about managing the product, the design of the product or the service or the program, managing the people around it, managing the organization. And these are the key parts of any type of startup. And one of the things I'm going to point out is that the word startup is a little challenging because it implies that it's a new organization. But when you think about a startup, it's any initiative, anything that you're doing that's new and innovative within your organization, you can apply these exact same principles. We ended up going and training about 100 plus people at Accion, a microfinance nonprofit, and we helped them develop the mindset and learn this process to build out products and services and programs for the people they serve. So this can be in any case, can be building a new organization or working within an organization. And this is the kind of the stuff that we do within nonprofits. So there are 3 pieces to building out a startup. And the core thing of what you try to do is build what we call a minimal viable product. What's the idea or project? What's the thing that you can build that has minimal resources that you can test out and validate whether people actually want it and will use it? And that's the core of Lean Startup, and I think it's absolutely essential for the social entrepreneurship space and social impact space. And the reason why is we tend to build programs or products or services and then try to shove our customers or who we serve into them. And usually what happens is there's not a good fit. I saw this at Girl Scouts pretty regularly. We built out a lot of programming that the girls did not like because they did not actually, one of my challenges was to survey and measure whether there was the impact of the development program. Turned out the girls did not like a lot of the programs and activities because they were heavily based on reading and they felt like they were going to school, from school to school, after school. And it's because they did not work with their customers or who they were serving, which is the girls. So how do you ensure that you're building something that not only has some kind of impact, but the maximum amount of impact? And that's what we're going to go through here. So there's 3 pieces, and we'll go through these 3 pieces. So when we think about Lean Startup, and kind of taking a step back, we took Lean Startup and we teach a workshop called Lean Startup for Social Innovation. And that's focused on translating everything from the Lean Startup and tech space and applying it to nonprofits and social enterprises. But when we think about Lean Startup, it's a scientific process. And when you think about scientific processes, you're testing hypotheses and you're making decisions based on data, not necessarily on hunches, with an emphasis on validated learning. So you're learning something and then validating the idea that uses customer development, meaning you're working with the customers, you're exploring and experimenting and iterating to build a better product, project, or company that customers or constituents actually want. So when you think about just language-wise, when you talk about customers, I think about anybody you're serving in the nonprofit or for-profit sector. And we'll break down some of these, but again, it's a core process that we can follow. And as I mentioned, building a minimal viable product takes these 3 pieces: customer development, pitch, and manual delivery. We're going to focus on the customer development because it's essential that we have this mindset for anybody who wants to start something as you leave this room. So the foundation for every successful startup, program, or initiative is this concept of customer or constituent development. So when we teach people, and I work with people about building startups or any social entrepreneur, I ask them two questions. Tons of people come up to me and say they have this idea, and or they built this platform, or they have this program that they want to help people, and I ask them two questions: who is your customer, and what's their problem? They always come to me with a solution, that they have a solution for a problem, or they've never validated it. So who's your customer, and what's their problem? And usually when I tell someone, ask them the customer, it's everybody, right? They want to help everybody. And you need to get very, very specific because you need to be able to test it. And that's great. But I think one of the things that's a challenge with the social impact, social entrepreneurship space is someone comes with an idea and they share it with someone and people say, that's awesome, you should go do it. And that's sometimes the worst advice, is that it doesn't necessarily always have to be built. So it's focusing on who your customer is and then validating what is their true problem. So one example is for one of our classes about a year and a half ago, there was someone that came in to our class and they had an idea because they recognized the problem in the area that they lived at, New York City, I believe it was in the Bronx, is that they didn't have access to broadband. And if you have access to the internet and broadband, people will have access to this information, their lives will be better, they'll be able to, so their lives will be better if they have access to information. Had been spending lots of time building out this nonprofit, done paperwork, done all this research, was about to launch it. I believe broadband was in the name. And then, so we asked them, okay, who's your customer and what's their problem, right? So when we asked him what the customer was, there was lots of different people. So we had him get very, very, very specific. So he could connect and interview these people. And then the problem was they didn't have access to broadband. And what we did is we had him get out of the building, meaning we do something scary, which is we have them talk to their customers or who they're serving. And that's not always the case, right? Think about a business plan. Your business plan is you do all this library research, you do all this market research, you build a 45-page business plan, and then what happens, right? You try to launch a business. But Steve Blank, the kind of the godfather of customer development, said a business plan is like war. It never survives its first customer, just like a war plan never survives its first battle. So it's really about, we have them get out of the building, meaning actually go and talk to their customers. So we teach them how to do customer development interviews, to go and identify the customer, what their problem is, and then go and talk to a set of customers or people they want to serve to just get insights and information on to validate whether they actually do have a problem. And this is the reason why it's extremely important, because a lot of times people will have an idea and then they'll refine it, and then come to here, and this is their startup or their project, where the best solution could have been someplace else. So we have people go and explore and experiment and then validate to get onto the right path so that they can refine from a particular point with information. So this guy went out to the Bronx, and we teach them how to do interviews so they don't get biased information, and it's really a narrative of an interview. And within the first 3 people that they spoke with, he found out that one, people didn't know the name broadband, and the second is they didn't have a problem with internet access. And this was 4 years ago, so it wasn't as the internet wasn't as accessible, but everybody accessed it on their phone. They didn't need broadband. There was no need for it. And so they were accessing the internet. So he was going to build an entire startup based on assumptions and not validating and not working with the people that he actually wanted to serve. So this is really the core piece of what we try to do when I ask people this question. And a lot of social entrepreneurs get pretty offended by asking them this question, but they need to answer this. There was an event recently where someone had built this platform to connect nonprofits to donors, and he had spent tens of thousands of dollars. And I asked him these 2 questions, and he could not give me a straight answer without it taking 15 minutes. And I just told him, until you get to this point, and he wanted to connect with Be Social Change so we can connect him to lots of nonprofits. And until he was able to get this, it was very challenging for me to really want to engage and help him because he hadn't answered these basic questions. So the purpose of getting out of the building is to humanize who your target customer is. So finding more and more about who they are, what their likes are, what their dislikes are, and what their actual problem is, to really get a true sense of, am I building something that they truly want and need? And this is kind of this process of a minimal viable product, which I think is hugely important, is you think about, you have an idea, you build it, And in this case, this was tech, but you build it. This could be code. You measure, you get data, and you learn, and then it's this continual cycle of innovation. So if you type up lean startup in here, there's lots of different processes, but I think it's really core to think about who are the people you're serving, what is their true problem, and then building a solution around that. So before we get into the social entrepreneurship piece, I wanted to see if anybody had any questions about lean or what we just went through. Any disagreement? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It is, and this is the thing, and you pointed something out really important, which is kind of what I say at the end, but it's a framework. It is not a step by step by step by step. There's agile. There's a number of other methodologies, and I think the biggest thing when we teach people through this is like when we did the training for Axion, we were the first. Accidentally, we were the first presentation of their 2-day conference, and the COO emailed us and they're like, "You changed the way people are talking about the products." Because people were talking and they were like, "Oh, we should do this, we should do this," and they were questioning, "Well, did you talk to the customers or did you talk to the people they're serving?" And it's that framework shift is I think the biggest piece. Going step by step is very challenging. Yeah, and I think yeah, and I think the other challenging thing and what we do with our lean startup for social innovation workshops is that with a tech product, you're building fast. Whereas with a nonprofit or social enterprise, you're building something that may take 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So we work with other lean startups. When we first started, we had lean people come in and teach nonprofits and work with them. It just did not make sense. So we had to make that transition. Yeah. Oh yeah, it was just more of like if anybody had any challenges with lean. Oh, gotcha. Perfect, perfect. We'll do. Yeah. I would say yes and no, because those people are still within the system, and that system is still affecting people. You're engaging with that systemic change because it's impacting people, right? So you can still gain insights as to how it's impacting. If you're trying to change a system without actually talking to the people it's affecting, then you might build system or go down a path that's trying to change something. I mean, this is kind of a little random example that popped up. I was just in Portland this past week, and my girlfriend and I were traveling, and we went through this huge dam. And we were just talking about dams, and she was talking about how fascinating it was. Um, and Western International Development, they ended up building all these dams in certain parts of Africa. And what happened is that for have access to water, etc., turned out it created very still water that increased malaria. So unless you're working with, it's another example is that international development, everybody needs wells, right? Everybody needs wells. You build wells, and then people have access to water. So one international development organization, they ended up building some wells, and then they were being destroyed. They couldn't figure out why. So it turned out that the women would spend 6 hours going to go get water back and forth every day, but it was the only time they could get away from their husbands or get away from the community. But they did not talk to the women who were actually getting the water. So I think it's extremely important to engage with both, with both. Cool. Yeah. And I can share this with you all, this deck for sure in this. And this is kind of the minimal viable product lean process. But I'm going to go through this because there's a lot of stuff to go through. So from entrepreneurship to social entrepreneurship. So just as we have this process, then how do we end up integrating and pulling it in? So the three pieces of social entrepreneurship, social enterprise, and social innovation, this is just a little bit of the language, right? So when you think about social entrepreneurship, there's some people think about it in a broad perspective, some people think about it narrow. I think it's getting a little more broad. If you look up some articles in Stanford Social Innovation Review, some people said it had to be very narrow, only people who are starting for-profit enterprises, because if it's too broad, it's not going to have any meaning. Some people think that it needs to be broad. I'm a little bit more on the broader side, but there isn't always the best definition. Does it include nonprofits? Does it include for-profits? What does that mean? Is Facebook a social entrepreneurship? Is Google a social enterprise? So there's a little bit of confusion still around that. No definitive definition. When it comes to social enterprise, some people say it's only a for-profit company. Some include a nonprofit. I typically think of social enterprise as a for-profit, socially conscious organization. One of my former employees said that it included nonprofits, so there's confusion around that. There's social ventures, there's a number of different terms. And then social innovation is actually the product or the service or the program. So think about it in terms of the process and also the social entrepreneur, the individual, the organization type, social enterprise, and then you can say nonprofit. And then social innovation is that product or service or the thing that's new and different. Again, there isn't a direct definition. There is not definitive, but these are kind of the core things of how people end up defining it. And just a little bit of giving some context of social entrepreneurship. Again, it's been around. There's been people that have been producing and building organizations using entrepreneurial principles for a really long time. But a few things that just have helped accelerate the usage of the term. In the 1980s, nonprofits were searching for new sources of revenue, particularly earned income, and also using business methods to support their work. So how much revenue do you think Girl Scouts brings in from Girl Scout cookies every year? Guess. Throw some 5 million. At the time, I think in 2010, it was around 700 million. So yeah, and sometimes, and I've heard stories, they get heat because they're selling cookies as a for-profit endeavor, but for them, they're using that as a vehicle to teach entrepreneurship to the girls. And we're not going to get into too much detail. I don't know how much you're going to get into detail about building a nonprofit, but that can jeopardize your nonprofit status. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Private citizens, so for-profit, so private citizens were creating businesses that had a socially conscious mission, clean tech, solar, those were kind of the things that were driving it. And then Bill Drayton in the 80s was traveling around the world, found these entrepreneurs that were doing good and solving social and environmental problems. And that's where he came up really with the term social entrepreneur, and it really became very common as he started an organization called Ashoka, and that was really started to support social entrepreneurs around the world. And then now it's grown because the entrepreneurship era came into play, and now people are wanting to, especially driven by millennials, wanting to create businesses that have a socially conscious mission. So now we're going to go over some organizational structures and a little bit of the hybrid type of organizations that are going through. But overall, when I think about social entrepreneurship or social impact, obviously I include nonprofits. Be Social Change is a nonprofit. We're actually dissolving a nonprofit and becoming a for-profit, which is an interesting story that I can chat about if I have some time, because it fits our model of innovating, creating new and different things. But these are kind of the core things that, in terms of the organizational structures. We're going to spend a lot of time in B Corp because I think that's a hugely important and driver of the social entrepreneurship space. But we have nonprofits, which are traditional nonprofits, Girl Scouts, Red Cross. I'm going to go through some case studies of more younger nonprofits that are doing really innovative things. So typically nonprofit, and Foundation Center is the most amazing resource for that. You apply for a state as well as IRS certification, not our certification, but it's a legal entity. We're a nonprofit based in New York, Be Social Change. We never got our 501c3 status because we didn't apply for that, which is great because it helps us dissolve a little bit faster. But once you do that as a nonprofit, you can solicit donations, you can apply for grants, and that's kind of the core revenue stream when it comes to most nonprofits. You can generate revenue similar to Girl Scouts, but if that becomes one of your main revenue sources, it could jeopardize your nonprofit status, especially if it's outside your mission. So say a nonprofit has an education-based nonprofit that has an amazing t-shirt, starts bringing millions of dollars in from a t-shirt, that's hard to reconcile that that's part of your mission versus you being a clothing company. So social enterprise, and we'll talk a little bit more about these. So the challenge over pretty much for the past 50 years, but currently now, is how do you determine what is a socially conscious for-profit organization? And there have been LEED certifications, there's been fair trade, And that's been kind of the main thing. But a lot of the challenge has been what a common term is greenwashing, which is for-profit companies marketing that they're sustainable, marketing that they're doing all this good, but they're also actually doing harm. There's this really great article that I can send you that was just in the about I forgot what his last name is, but he really talked about, he's from the Aspen Institute, gave this great speech about how for-profit companies and corporations tend to have a pass because they're actually doing harm for the world, but they can have a CSR program, or they can send schools to a certain help number of underprivileged kids go code. And hold on real quick. And it gives them a free pass because they're not criticized as much for the damage that they can do. And there hasn't been anything that allows both an organization that's doing good but also not doing harm, which I think is the next step. Not just giving a certain percentage of your dollars to foundations, but also how do you prevent doing harm to the world? Yeah. Which is what? Which is what? Oh, good. That's amazing. Yeah. So there's an article 3 weeks ago in the New York Times business section about greenwashing. So there wasn't always how do you end up truly knowing whether an organization is doing good but also not doing any harm. So there's organizations that you can tell, and they're pretty transparent. Honest Tea, Kind, REI, we'll talk about those in a bit. Just ended up hearing the founder, this current CEO of REI, doing amazing work from sustainability as well as building infrastructure within the national parks. Kind has grown and is doing amazing work there. Just as an FYI, from a funding standpoint, they give $10,000 away every month to a project that's Kind. You can go on the website. And then Honest Tea is doing some really amazing stuff in terms of their tea, but one of the founders, I believe, is working on a new startup to replace meat so that a burger will actually taste like a burger, but it's not real meat. So there's these social enterprises that aren't necessarily B Corps. And then there's a B Corp certification. How many people know about B Corps? So we'll go over a little bit about the infrastructure. They teach a workshop for us, and I took a little number of their slides. But essentially, it is a certification that a for-profit company can go through that demonstrates they're abiding by certain social, environmental, and organizational standards. So they go through this diagnostic, and they get a score, and they pass or they fail. And if they pass, they're able to put that B Corp certification on every part of their branding, and they become part of this really, really great community. But it's that first step to be able to actually validate whether the organization is abiding by all those standards. The organizational piece, I think, is hugely valuable because it checks to see, are they treating their workers well? Are they having paid vacation? Do they have maternity leave? And I have to say, many nonprofits don't actually do that well on the organizational piece. They have a socially conscious mission, but they're working their employees to death. Not all nonprofits, but that still is the case. And I don't know how many nonprofits would pass this B Corp certification. So I think that was the hugely valuable thing. So Etsy, for example, took the B Corp certification, had this huge kind of thing that they were going to, with the organization that they were going to become B Corps, barely passed. And they're open about this. So they're like, everybody loved working for Etsy, and they had an amazing culture. But they're like, why did we just barely pass? So they actually created an entire department to try to implement B Corp. To figure out how they could become a better organization. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah, it's the same thing. And there's a slide I didn't include, but Kickstarter. We'll go through a number of organizations. Yeah. So we can kind of go through this. So and then there's another designation which we'll go through is for-profit, a B Corp corporation. The certification is just a certification. It's not a legal entity. The B Corp corporation is a legal entity, like an LLC. And we'll go a little bit into this of how you can become a B Corp right off the bat. So their mission is to go from this certification piece to have an actual certification from an organization as a whole. So these are just some of the requirements on the actual diagnostic. So governance, it deals with workers, it deals with community like suppliers, diversity. Do they engage in charity volunteerism? The impact model, what kind of impact do they have? How are they having an impact on the environment? So these are the core measures that never before have organizations ever had to go through in such a stringent way. And this is the difference between B Corp certification and the corporation. So the certification is actually conferred by the nonprofit B Lab. They meet certain standards. They actually have to change their articles. A corporation is a corporate form similar to a C Corp or S Corp that has a higher level of transparency and accountability and purpose. So that's available in 27 states. It's a state, but just like you said, there's lots of B Corps that are popping up. I was going to say, so right here, I think it's over 1,500 B Corps now in 42 countries and many other industries. But what's interesting is like that's not that many B Corps. But the last time I spoke with someone from B Corp, probably many months ago, they had over 25,000 companies around the world using the diagnostic. So it is the first path for organizations to go through and help them navigate this socially conscious path. So this is where I think is hugely important. B Corp is that I think is going to be a core pillar in the nonprofit space. I mean, in the social sector, because it's the way in which organizations can be transparent while they're socially conscious. Yeah. It's so new. It's so new. It's only, and I'll give you a little reason of why B Corp came about. So just quickly, there's like breweries, the Ben and Jerry's is a B Corp. And these are some of the examples, and I'll get to that question in a bit. So they 100% employee owned, donate to every nonprofit. So there's all these really interesting parts of how they become socially conscious. But this is the biggest piece. I'll actually do that in a bit. So I interviewed the founder of B Corp, and what he found is he started an organization called And One. It was a basketball clothing company, built this huge organization. Everybody loved working for it, had amazing benefits. And when you reach a certain point, you have to scale. You need to get access to greater supply chain, et cetera. So they got bought out by a publicly traded company. And what's the purpose of a publicly traded company? Make as much profit as possible. So the company slashed all the benefits, slashed all the things that he built this organization to be, and he wanted to figure out how can I prevent that from happening. And that's where B Corp came into play. So one of the things, one more thing. When I was interviewing him, I was talking to him about how B Corp and this symbol, which you'll start seeing more and more in the coming years, is where's the biggest impact that it's having. And it's not so much, and we'll talk about it, and it's not so much in terms of selling more, but it is on employee engagement and retainment, especially millennials. It is huge in terms of recruitment. And one of the things that's been really interesting is these stats that they just came out with. B Corps are 63% more likely to survive the average small business, 73% more likely to pay all employees a bonus, 46% more likely to have satisfied, engaged employees, more likely to use suppliers for low-income communities, 47% more likely to use on-site renewable energy. They are completely rocking it when it comes to the business realm and socially conscious piece. But this is where I think is so hugely important. B Corps are 40% more likely to have satisfied, engaged employees, less burnout, more overall performance. Almost 2/3 of millennials said they would rather make $40,000 a year at a job they love than $100,000 at a year they think it's boring. It is completely amazing at the level of satisfaction that employees have at B Corps. And that's where I think is going to be the huge piece of how they're impacting the social impact space. So Kickstarter just became a B Corp. They just introduced this process where typically you had to be about 2 years in to be a B Corp. Now you can be a startup and start that process right from the beginning. So more and more startups are going to be coming through this path, but it's very young. It's very, very young. I just was in Portland and just saw the first B Corp certified grocery store in America, and I'm seeing more and more and more. So we're going to go through, so that was B Corp. We're going to go through a couple nonprofits and just tell you a little bit about over the next 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to Q&A. But just a couple different types of nonprofits that are doing really interesting stuff. So one of them is Pencils of Promise. So I bring them in with Charity Water. And what they have done is they, many years ago, were the first really to leverage social media and narrative and business principles and marketing principles to really engage and grow their organizations. So they're at a point now where 100% of their dollar that they raise, that you donate to, goes directly to impact. And they've been able to come up with an innovative model where it's an attractive brand people want to be engaged with. And then they work with corporate partners as well as business and philanthropists to cover their operating costs on the back end. So every engagement with an individual donor is direct impact. And that's always one of the challenges with nonprofits, right? Is how much do we spend on marketing and how much do we use donations for that piece? They've been able to figure out a way, and it's much easier said than done, but been able to use narrative and business principles and marketing to really engage donors, create a really, really beautiful brand. One of the things they did is they had a amazing photographer go and take pictures of the impact that they had. So they not only are open and transparent about their data, but they also used storytelling as a huge way to engage donors, which is very different than typical traditional nonprofits. They are shifting, but they're shifting because of these types of organizations. There's another awesome organization, Drive Change. So they are a nonprofit that operates food carts, locally sourced food trucks, that hires, teaches, and empowers formerly incarcerated youth. So what's interesting about them is they are a hybrid. They're a nonprofit and a for-profit. And they had to go through this process because they use a nonprofit. I believe their structure is they use a nonprofit for the training, so they get donations that way. But I believe the food trucks are a for-profit entity. And they had to navigate that and figure out how to go through that process of having these hybrid organizations. And that's been the case with the Mozilla Foundation as well. So Mozilla Foundation, open source nonprofit based in Canada, and then they ended up having a really great partnership with Google to become the default search engine and started making hundreds of millions of dollars. That was too much but they were focused on open source knowledge. So they had to actually create a for-profit entity and separate the two. So there's a Mozilla Foundation, and now there's a for-profit company that helps fund the nonprofit piece. So really thinking about, it's not just a nonprofit or a for-profit, but what are ways in which you can engage both types of structures to achieve your mission. So now moving on to the for-profit space. This is a friend of mine, Anthony Thomas, this really cool organization, No Clothing. So No Clothing was built out with a mission to end homelessness, for-profit social enterprise. And I use this because I give this as an example of Tom's Shoes. So Tom's Shoes, one-for-one model, similar to Warby Parker. So you buy one pair of shoes, they give a pair of shoes in a developing country. They had these trips to do all these shoe drops and all these other things. Turned out they were actually destroying the shoe economy in a local area. And also doing harm in some ways because it good intentions, but some of the shoes were actually not really that well designed or didn't have a lot of high quality. So they did the opposite of lean, right? So what Anthony did and his co-founder is he ended up going and doing research and actually talking to homeless people and also with the nonprofit organizations that serve homeless people. And he found that homeless people tend not to need jackets or blankets or extra clothes. They need to wear underwear, but more importantly, and socks and job training. So that's where he ended up doing his focus. It's like he actually engaged with the people he wanted to serve instead of assuming, which in many ways we tend to assume, especially in international development, that we know better than the people that we're wanting to serve. So for-profit company, but then works with a lot of nonprofits to, both from a strategic standpoint, but also a financial standpoint. So we talked about Kind. Kind's, again, really interesting. For-profit company, obviously with an intention of trying to have people have healthier snacks, but necessarily at the beginning had this kind of purpose, socially conscious mission per se, although I say it was. But now they're at this point where they've just grown into such a huge organization that and great culture, we partner with them on a lot of different things. They have the ability to impact people on so many different levels. Like I said, they give $10,000 away to projects, and they wouldn't have been able to do that if they didn't grow. They're also leveraging their presence to integrate kindness and humility, and there's a huge social justice piece that I just heard him speak a couple days ago, integrated into the organization and the mission. So they're able to do that on a large level, and I'll get back to that impact piece because this organization, Tasty Bite, has everybody had Tasty Bite? Some of the most delicious Indian food that you'll ever get prepackaged. So the founder was working in India, found this company that was selling prepackaged, vacuum-sealed food products, and probably I think in the 90s, early 2000s, and was kind of struggling. Comes back to the U.S., goes to Whole Foods and other stores, realizes in the Indian aisle there's no prepackaged food, only spices. So he goes back, raises money, ends up buying this along with the surrounding land, and ends up coming up with Tasty Bite and the first prepackaged Indian food. Now it has lots of different foods. But this is what's interesting about this, is that he ended up market testing the branding significantly. He ended up, the packaging, if you see the packaging has it essentially looks like this, but he ended up having a mission and purpose focused part and the story, the narrative, their impact in the front versus testing it that didn't have it. And that actually did increase sales. purpose did not increase sales. Social impact did not increase sales. But what it turned out, good packaging, branding, and good-looking food actually did. But when he ended up having the narrative on the back, it increased brand loyalty. If people are attracted to the product, they can read about it on the back. That actually increases brand loyalty and sales. And that's actually the case with Warby Parker. Warby Parker leads. They have a great user engagement. You buy a pair of you go online, you pick 5 glasses, they ship them to you. You see which ones you like, you ship them back for free, and then they send you your glasses, usually under $100. But they found what sells glasses: good-looking people, awesome design, great engagement, and then you have the one-for-one model, and they have a one-for-one model like Tom's. But what I found in all my social entrepreneurship classes and people that I talk about with Warby is if they end up buying a pair of glasses and not knowing the socially conscious mission, which is they work with Vision Springs, a nonprofit in a developing international development nonprofit to help provide better eye care. When someone buys the glasses and they find out, they're going to buy Warby Parker glasses every time. So there's that brand loyalty piece. It's switching, and we're going to talk about consumer behavior and how it's changing. But right now, purpose and impact is not causing a dramatic increase in sales. It's more about branding as well as recruitment and retainment. It is changing, but it's not as big as what people think. We talked about Etsy, but one of the ones that's interesting is Patagonia. So Patagonia has this, they're a B Corp, they do amazing sustainability work, and they did this on Black Friday, or don't buy this jacket. REI did the same thing, where REI has been in the news because they're paying all their employees to take off on Black Friday and go hiking, because it's not with their values. Black Friday and the craziness that happens is not aligned with what their core values are. So there are organizations that are taking a stand and setting examples for what it means to be a socially conscious organization. Yep, so that's perfect. Yep. And they are a co-partner. Huge. Exactly, I'm glad you brought that up. And they changed their logo now. It says Co-op now. And that's another interesting new model. It's like Ben Jerry's, there's a few others, and it's member owned. And when I was in Portland, and I heard him speak, these people when they were doing the Q&A, a lot in Seattle, I heard him speak, and there were a bunch of board members, co-op members that were raising their hands and asking questions, and they were just so thankful. So I think there's another new model for a for-profit company. So in terms of trends, we talked about the challenge of the definition. We did not talk about impact assessment, which is a whole other crazy issue in itself. But how do you end up measuring impact? B Corp is one way to do it, but also in the nonprofit sector. Funding opportunities, I'll talk about in a bit. There needs to be more successes and case studies, just like you said. We're just at the beginning stages of what it means to be a socially conscious organization that's for-profit, sharing of best practices, business models, and failures. And ecosystem building. And we're really focused on this, right? Is helping do that in New York City. We're launching a Be Social Change media platform called Be Social Change Insights next year that's really about sharing these best practices, so online content. So in terms of the funding opportunities, just quickly, as I said, there was that path for funding in the for-profit space. What's interesting is that in the social entrepreneurship space, for-profit companies, there's that missing middle. So you can start, and I see so many people start for-profit companies with a socially conscious mission. They're building something, they may not validate it, they could validate it, but raising money is challenging. There's this whole idea of impact investing, and it's a huge buzzword, but it actually doesn't trickle down into younger startups. It's only for organizations that are much higher level, tends to be nonprofits as well, at the $3 million range. There aren't any impact angels. But part of it is, this is the reason why we started the social entrepreneurship curriculum, and now we're trying to figure out what this looks like, is sometimes there aren't a lot of social enterprises worth investing in, right? You have a lot of people that have a really great intention, but they don't have the business acumen, or they're not necessarily validating their idea. So there is this interesting part where there isn't as much funding. There's Ashoka, but there's Echoing Green is a really great organization that provides startup funding, and a few others. But we're not quite there. It's transitioning. There are some angel investors that are making little bets on startups, but it's more challenging. Also, it tends to be a tech startup in the tech scene, whereas a nonprofit or even a for-profit company, they're trying to solve something that requires much more time and energy, and more importantly, the biggest thing with for-profit tech companies is they want to sell. Like if they get investment, it's what's your exit. And as a social entrepreneur, you're not thinking about what's your exit, you're thinking about what's your impact. So that's a challenging area that we're finding in terms of the funding opportunities. We're getting there, but it's to be determined. So just quickly in terms of some trends. So this is from an organization called Edelman, and they run a study called Good Purpose, and they do consumer behavior trends. And what they found was when quality and price are the same, social purpose is the most important factor in deciding what consumers will buy, right? So impact and purpose is becoming a greater factor in terms of whether people will buy one product or not when price and quality are the same. Problem is, it's rarely the same. So if you're building a sustainable company, sustainable supply chain and everything in between, your products are going to be much more expensive, right? So consumers have to decide on whether they're going to pay a premium. Not always as easy from a social justice standpoint in terms of low income people being able to do that. It's getting there, but that's one of the challenges where it's not as easy. If you're doing pants that are a sustainable clothing company, the pants are going to be $100 versus going to Old Navy and buying for $10. He was first, yeah.
All right. People,
Oh,
people will pay more when there's not a recession. You're starting in 2008, the recession. People have less disposable income. We started out of that process. People are now got more money, so they're more willing to be a conscious consumer.
yeah, so out of a recession, and you're absolutely right. And this is actually from previous years. The other side of it, and I agree with you, then the other piece of that is there's other trends that are helping to raise the consciousness, like the food movement and organic food movement and others. And other sustainable products, and it's getting there, but it is on the rise. Not in terms of quality and price, it's challenging. Yeah, go ahead.
It must be true because it's on the internet, right? How many of you actually believe what a corporation says regarding their product?
Yeah, and that's kind of the B Corp, right? So that's, I think, one of the more interesting things. But yeah, yeah. And you're right, it is getting there, and that's one of the more significant things. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see whether there's that little bit of a curve higher up with as we're out of the recession. This is the other piece as well that goes on to what you're saying is more people are purchasing from cause-supporting brands, and part of it is because there's a proliferation of it. There's a lot more brands that are both marketing, but also in general providing more access to to socially conscious products. But I think this is one of the core things we'll open up for Q&A in a bit, is that it's not just about social entrepreneurship. So there's this whole crazy slide here, but we only talked about this little small part, which is nonprofits, for-profits, and hybrids, how they vary by field. So just really social entrepreneurship in the organizations. But there's a whole other sector of the social entrepreneurship and nonprofit space in here. So there's the financial capital piece, which we spoke about. There's this human capital piece, which is for colleges, universities, people learning about this, getting trained. The intellectual capital, consultants, academic researchers. The political as well as politics. Would B Corp ever get tax benefits, right? I think that's a very interesting question to ensure that for-profits are becoming B Corps. There's the media piece, which is greater access to case studies, and then economic and social conditions. The reason I bring this slide up is because the vast majority of people should not start businesses, for-profits or nonprofits, or they shouldn't start them at the moment. So it's really this idea of, when I think about, are you a startup builder or an impact amplifier? Very much, I nail this down, I hammer this down when I teach at colleges. And this purpose-driven career workshop that I produce is that you don't necessarily default to a founder or a CEO. Check to see what's out there and see if you can amplify the impact of someone versus trying to start something new. But there's also all these other opportunities aside from starting an organization within the social entrepreneurship realm. And this is kind of the core slide in terms of any nonprofit or for-profit company, which is this is what people think about success. And this is even going to lean, right? A, B, C, D, E, and it's all this craziness. Yeah, I know. I've been 3 years building Be Social Change in the trenches, working X number of ridiculous hours trying to figure this all out. And we finally have come up to where we're going to be growing and scaling rapidly in 2016. But when I say scale, more an impact, not by employees. We have a very ridiculously small team, but it's just all this craziness that happens. And this is not only the actual process of building the organization, but there's a psychological toll here. One of the emerging things that's happening, and I think it's something because my background in psychology, it's happening in the entrepreneurship, but also social entrepreneurship space I want to plug in, is the psychological toll that entrepreneurship has and preparation that's required for that, as well as the community to support in that process. So that is the end of the presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions, but if anybody wanted to, I can pass this mic around and maybe, yeah.
I have the mic, so just raise your hand and then I'll give you the mic. It's so we can hear you when we're streaming it to people who are listening online.
That's
Is that
perfect.
perfect?
And if anybody
All right.
wants to email me, you can email me at Marcos at Be Social Change. I can send you the deck if you shoot me an email. So yeah, love to open up to any questions.
I think it's a great presentation. First of all, thank you. But I did also want to give a shout out since you brought him up, Tasty Bites.
Yes.
Ample Harvest Order, which I run as a national program to allow gardeners to donate excess food to local food pantries nationwide. Tasty Bites provided us with support, but more importantly, this past year, Tasty Bite mailed out 10,000 packets of seeds with our logo on it to gardeners across the country who asked so that they too could donate food from their garden to food pantries. So they not only provided us with support, they provided, using our model for 10,000 other gardeners around the country to also get in and to help nourish their own community. So they were taking this approach from two different directions, supporting us and supporting our mission on a much bigger level.
Amazing. Yeah, and it's the founder is phenomenal. And it's like those, I mean, it's really great, and I'd even just love to just connect with you after, is like those are the type of stories and narratives that need to get out, especially to larger organizations, to give an example of how you can end up not only just giving back, but how can you co-create and leverage resources to grow together.
Can you talk a little bit more about how to start using those practices of social entrepreneurship and social innovation in a not-for-profit that's already established?
Yeah. So one example, and I'll give you two ways. If you're just about to start a program, like when we build out a curriculum or we test out new classes, we do it in a very lean way. Just what is the minimal thing that we can do to get out to customers or who we're serving, and then use data in that kind of way. So that's something that you just do on a new project. But if it's already kind of a larger, because you think about nonprofits and something that's 5-year out, strategic planning, you have all that stuff. One example, it's actually in the Lean Startup book, is a woman from HP. She was the social innovation director of social innovation. And she was brought in to redesign the volunteer program for HP, which had 400,000 people globally. So what she had to do was your strategic planning. Again, it's just a framework, right? You're doing your whole normal strategic planning. You can't upend the infrastructure of an organization. So you go down that process. But as she was mapping out what this would look like in this 5-year plan, she started doing little experiments and connecting with the because she was wanting to engage employees on how they wanted to volunteer, what was preventing them. And she was doing little experiments, little programs, getting regular feedback in order to inform the actual strategic plan. So again, it's even just as basic as ensuring that you're talking with people that you want to build out. One of the challenges that I've had with other nonprofits programmatically is they're in such a rush to build something out and to develop the program. And again, they should try to fit people in to a program afterwards. And that front loading, that time and energy that it takes at the beginning saves so much time. But it's a mental shift. Yeah. So
Marcos, I believe at the beginning of your presentation you said part of Be Social Change is to educate the next generation of entrepreneurs.
partially, yeah.
Okay. The movie The Intern notwithstanding, in your classes, how do you re-educate, to use that term, millennials to be able to manage people who may be on their staffs or in their businesses who are 40, 50, 60 years old?
Yeah.
Because there's a significant gap in the way people think, behave,
Totally.
and I'm curious to hear how you do that,
Yeah. So
if
this
they even hire them.
And this is one of the things. So
Thank
we
you.
work with Encore.org, and we're having really strong discussions with Encore.org on how do we serve a large, diverse demographic at all age levels, like at all socioeconomic levels, but ages of peace, right? So one of the core things, and this is what we're shifting towards, and this is, you'll get the little scoop in terms of how we're going to be focusing in 2016, is that we started identifying why people are coming to us to be social change. And people want to find greater meaning and purpose. They want to create community and engage with like-minded people, and they want to grow their impact. But what we started to see, and what we've seen the biggest impact in all the classes I teach: Intro to Social Entrepreneurship, personal branding, networking. I have our managing for the 21st century. We're just at the beginning talks of hosting that here at Foundation Center next year. Is framework shifting. It's all mindset shifting, right? Because if you can shift people's mindsets, all the content experience that comes through that is through there. So quickly, in terms of the management workshop. So there's a number of management organizations in the nonprofit sector and for-profit sector. And if you look, they're all traditional hierarchical boss-subordinate approaches. And that just doesn't make sense today. That's the first thing. So one of the things that I do in the workshop is I take people through those definitions of management and how we need a new type of management. Then I tell people, okay, at the core, the purpose of an organization is a vehicle for human collaboration to create work and to solve problems for other people. Organization, 2 people or more, vehicles for collaboration, but that collaboration has to be managed. That's the first thing. But then what is the most fundamental piece of management? And I ask people that, and they raise all the questions. And what's the most fundamental element? At the core, it's a relationship. At the core, it's a relationship. So I take people through a process of what's a healthy relationship: trust, openness, mutual interest, respect, vulnerability. And then I ask them, how many of your management relationships are like that? Virtually none. So that fundamental piece, independent if you're a millennial, independent if you are a boomer, if you're approaching a management relationship, at management within your organization as a relationship, and that the core is really building that core based on mutual respect, trust, vulnerability, then being able to manage different levels and different generations is easier. Management is one of the hardest things in the world. Managers have the ability to empower and unlock human potential and passion, but they also have the capacity to make an organization miserable. And that is actually in 2016, Be Social Change is fundamentally focused on nonprofit management. That is where we're moving towards a core focus, because we see that is one of the most significant ways that we can transform the nonprofit sector. And we won't be teaching it. We're going to core teaching it, but we want every nonprofit to be able to manage in this kind of way. You see that a little bit differently in younger nonprofits that are much more distributed power, distributed authority, versus when I was working at the older nonprofits, it was almost impossible to change the organization. So that is a core focus, but it's really about fundamentals and mindset shift. That's why the fundamentals of Lean was core of how I started this out. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. My question really is about, and I mentioned this to you before things started. I have a STEM education startup, quote unquote, and we are at a point where we are trying to make a decision on whether or not to form a nonprofit corporation or to start a benefit corporation, meaning a for-profit with a social impact. And I'm curious about your thoughts about the decision-making process as to which direction that anyone, not just me, but the direction that someone should go when they're in the midst of starting a new business.
Yeah, and I appreciate you asking that. I meant to cover that, and I switched the slide around for a few things today, but I typically cover that. So that's great. I'm glad you asked that. So, and why we're transitioning into a for-profit versus a nonprofit. And also heard the founder of Change.org also talk about this as well, like last year. So for a nonprofit, nonprofits are extremely effective if you have a very focused mission and you want to have direct impact. So it's really great. And there's a funding process for that, right? You build out your nonprofit, you get fiscal sponsorship, or you get donations and you can grow. So that's what's great about in terms of the for-profit. But it's harder to scale, right? And then also times grants, you tend to have to shift your focus a little bit to fit a grant. if you're wanting to become a B Corp or for-profit corporation, it's usually something that's scalable and that's tech focused. That is the decision point. It's, you know what it is? It's just really boiling down to money and where you're going to get your funding and what's available. As I mentioned, it sounds great, for-profit company, B Corp, and you're going to get money. But unless you're selling a product or service that a consumer can buy, it's very challenging to be addressing only a socially conscious, a social problem or environmental problem. Environment's a little more easier, solar, other things. But if you're not leveraging tech and you're more focused on programming, it's going to be very challenging for you to become a for-profit. So I would say that's the decision point. If you need investment to scale quickly, like Change.org, they raised like $20+ million because it turns out they get attacked by Russia all the time from hackers and they need high security because they have a huge email database. So they need to scale in that kind of way. Whereas an organization like Year Up or Teach for America, it wouldn't have made sense for them to be a for-profit. So it's really funding. Oh, yes, one more follow-up.
When you're talking about investment in that kind of thing, in the scaling up of your product, it seems, based on what you're saying, that if you're talking programming, that you're less inclined. But I'm wondering, especially with the movement towards, I'm talking education. Please forgive me for drilling down, but the model in the education world these days appears to be shifting more towards for-profit as opposed to the public sector. It's just it's the environment that we're in, with charter schools and privatization, et cetera, being bandied about, and that's why I'm pushing back a little bit to get a little more information.
Totally.
Please forgive.
So again, you have to go through who's your customer, what's the true problem they're serving, and is that a product or service that can scale and grow, and that you can make a significant revenue stream on that. I mean, that's the core thing. And if you can't, I mean, there's ed tech startups, right? So there's Newton. Newton's a for-profit company that does adaptive learning. They sell a huge tech product to Pearson that does the SATs. That totally makes sense. But if you're building out a program that's an after-school program for underserved youth, that's tech or whatever it is, that's a hard thing to scale, right? And who's going to give you investment for that? They can give you donations, right? But not necessarily investment. Because at the end of the day, and a lot of people forget, like when people invest, it is crazy what you need to do to show that you are actually going to grow and that you are going to make money. You need to do that. If you cannot do that, even if it's a lower amount, if you're a B Corp, you still need to go through that due diligence. And it sounds easy to become a B Corp, but at the end of the day, you have to be you have to make money. Yeah. And integrate the purpose plus profit. Yeah.
Marcos, there's a gap that I'm not sure that I can cross.
Yeah.
I was born in 1950. I entered the workforce in 1968, thereabouts. Probably got my working papers in 1966.
Yeah.
And I am familiar with the traditional management structure, and I know how it evolved. It went from the military into the paternal. You know, I'm going to be your daddy.
Yep. The family, right?
Right. But I went into project management, and it turned into a question of accountability. Somebody has to be responsible, and decision making. Somebody has to be willing and able to make a decision on partial information, regardless, because decisions have to be made.
Totally.
And what you were describing before about likability and affability, and we're all going to be friends, and it's all about the relationships, is great, but it doesn't go anywhere.
And why?
Without somebody being accountable and responsible for particular pieces happening at particular times.
Oh, 100%. And I think when you think about management, so think about management as a couple pieces, right? So there's the managing the self, which is kind of all the thing that we're talking about. There's emotional social intelligence, tons of research showing that that's actually better for organizations, your more successful career. Then there's managing the work, and then there's managing people. And that's an integration of all those three. You can't be, I mean, there is this thing where you have, and in some organizations it may work, but it's like flat organization, it's like no management, etc. I'm actually not and I know lots of people in that space that are doing self-management, and I actually think we're kind of hitting that rubber band piece where it's coming back. And there needs to be infrastructure and there needs to be core structure. And it's not throwing responsibility out, but what it is it's creating a space where conversations can be happening based on mutual trust. So here's an example, right? So you go and you're a manager and you're hiring in a traditional space. You're hiring someone and you kind of assume this person's going to be around for a long time, and you want that person, so you tell them there's this career trajectory, blah 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 blah. And to a certain extent, and what Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn says, that's based on a little bit of a lie. Then this interviewee is saying, oh, I'm going to stay with the organization for a while, especially if they're a millennial, probably planning on leaving it in a year or two, right? So right there at the beginning, this conversation and this relationship is built on a lie. But what if you said, and I do this with all the people I hire, what are your passions, what are your interests, what do you want to grow, how do you want to stretch, what are new things you want to get involved in, and really getting to know that person. But what if you said, where do you see and have them answer, where do you see yourself 5 years from now and outside of this organization? And understanding that they are going to leave the organization. They're going to. And that creates a dialogue for you to say, okay, how can I help you get there? How can these 2 or 3 years at this organization actually help you get there? What that's going to do is that's going to create trust, and that's going to create investment on that employee. And this is the more important thing. Organizations need to be set up with an understanding that people are going to be shuttled out every 2 years, or they're going to leave every 2 years. We talk about leadership transition, every transition. So, but this is why that relationship is so important. When a millennial or anybody does not have that relationship with their manager or organization, and I see this all the time with career coaching and all my clients, almost every client, they have to do the research on the slide. And then they get an offer and they come to you, I'm leaving in 2 weeks. And that program or department is in shambles. But what if you said, I'm looking to transition. I'm not being challenged here. Don't see a career trajectory. There's 2 things you can do. One, what can we do to figure this out? How can we help you? What are your responsibilities? And if not, you're giving me 2 months to figure this out, and you can be part of this process. If organizations do not set this up to as transitional structures, it's going to be a lot of time and energy wasted.
There was a time, and that was when people large enough to offer you the opportunity to move around within the company, and you so in a way that was not threatening, if you were not essentially saying that if you don't let me move, I'm leaving. And so this is essentially 2 weeks' notice, and then if you didn't find the spot, you were out. That has changed. You really can't do that. And what you're talking about is a complete different mindset that could take another generation to be implemented.
And I agree with you. I think that, and this is where I'm starting to see, there's this great book called In Reinventing Organizations, and it kind of takes different types of organizations through this process. So when I was at Girl Scouts, I tried to do exactly that, and the organization did not have the courage to put me in a position to create change, so I had to leave. It was just that simple. And it made me see that organizations that are that bureaucratic, it's not possible to change them in any significant way. So that's the first thing. But unless there's something major that happens that's causing a restructuring. But as a manager, you can help create a better orbit around you that can help you create more meaning or fulfillment in work. So that's that first piece. But that's where the creative destruction comes into play. That's where these younger nonprofits or for-profits that are starting at that stage that are upending these other traditional organizations as a whole. Now we're still at the beginning stages. We're totally figuring out what this mindset is. I just read this really great article about this startup that went through this self-management piece. And for the first 2 years, it was phenomenal, and they just grew like crazy. And then they got to a point that it was too big that people were getting confused. So he had to put an organizational chart. And he had to have a shift in mindset himself as well as with the company because they thought that was traditional. And it helped. So now we're at these stages of what does that look like after this phase? What's the first phase, second phase, third phase? So we're just at the beginning of its process. I think with Be Social Change, we want to be in that middle of at the ground floor and then pull all that content and then be able to share it with people. Yeah. But it is a big mindset shift. And that's why we're thinking mindset. not skill set. There's a lot of organizations that are great about skill set. Our greatest impact can be mindset and framework shift.
Since this gentleman here is my junior,
Uh-huh.
almost seems as if there could be a multi-generational collaboration of people with a certain level of expertise and experience who really would prefer to do something on a 2 or 3 year schedule
Mhm.
because we like to be change agents.
Yeah.
And it, the that it's a different, well, that's okay. I mean, no, some of us get bored after 2 or 3 years. It's not just the millennial issue, because there may not be the challenge, but it just seems as if it's a different mindset of certainly work.
Yeah.
But how does one get that to happen, since sometimes each of us in a generation have thought that we had the answers and our predecessors.
Yeah, and I think it was kind of what you were getting at. There's no loyalty on both ends anymore because the working world changes, right? There used to be, and it doesn't exist. And if you don't accept that, you're going to be in a very different mindset. There's an increase. I think I don't remember the stats. There's tons and tons coming out, but like by 2020 and 2025, the vast majority are going to be freelancers, etc. So what we teach at Be Social Change, what we teach at Be Social Change is like there's two constants in your career now. There's your personal brand, and then there's your network. So building out a personal brand and how you can strategically communicate your skills and operate as a freelancer and connect with people and create opportunities, that's the first. The second is that every opportunity is attached to another person. Think about that. Every opportunity is attached to another person, whether it's a job, a business opportunity. So how do you ensure that you have a network that you can access that or increase the chances? And more importantly, if you can access it, you're communicating that you can fulfill that opportunity. And that's just kind of the working world that we're living in. And it's being millennial driven, but it's kind of just like how they were set, how they grew up, right? And also the working world they're entering, which that traditional working world doesn't exist. But with Encore and a few other movements, there are people who've had longer careers that are wanting to transition in and have that type of career. So I agree that there's the collaboration still at the beginning stages. Like all this stuff we're doing, and this is where I think the social change has an opportunity, is building out that infrastructure and those pathways and those opportunities to help guide people. Because that's the thing. We're entering, as you're talking, into a little bit of a wild west, right? And what are those pathways? And we're kind of making it up as we go along. And I think there is a lot more personal responsibility that is forced upon us. But how can we create pathways and opportunities so that people can plug into BSC and then we push them out to the right resources, either through us or through others? And that's the more interesting thing.
Developing this mindset program for next year.
Is it on?
Okay, is that better? Are you thinking at all about this freelance economy? I mean, they're getting a free pass right now. You were talking earlier about B certification and B Corps and who is holding people accountable for their behaviors. So now we're going in the direction of a gazillion people developing their own little entities. Who is providing them the guidance about social responsibility? So you have these huge conglomerates, tossing them out the door to become freelancers who are misbehaving. But then is this just going to be replicated in all of these freelancers who are running around? Do you understand what I'm saying?
So I guess a couple of questions. Is it the freelancers that you're talking about, or are you talking about, I thought I heard like the Uberization, like Uber freelancers, like people are freelancers, Airbnb, that kind of stuff? Or are you talking about actual freelancers and how are they going to navigate this world?
Actually, that's a good point. I'm talking about both. Like
Okay.
Uber is piggybacking on a whole bunch of people's, tax dollars to underwrite the infrastructure of their business, right?
Yeah.
So, but then I was specifically starting with particularly within the millennium mindset, a whole bunch of young people who've not had a great deal of experience understanding social impact of business decisions in
Yeah.
a lot of different contexts. So is it part of your strategy is what I'm
You,
asking.
I mean, you're speaking to my heart. It's true. And this has taken a while to get to this point. So again, we've been focused on career building and finding purpose. That's a hook, right? And sometimes the career and making money is the hook, and then we secretly shift their framework to have what I call a B social change framework, which is the B, which is that internal, creating more purpose and having more meaning, and then also kind of see what kind of issues you want to impact. The social piece, which is the community piece, finding your tribe, collaborating, and then the change piece, which is creating impact. So that's like this be social change mindset. But underlying that, not only in terms of the individual piece and you're getting onto it, and I was thinking about this on my vacation our travels the past week and a half and talking with someone about it, is there's a social justice piece. And I think that is a missing element to the vast majority of people who call themselves social entrepreneurs or wanting to create some kind of impact. So who is going to provide for the security of those people that are freelancing? Right now, Uber doesn't have to, right? They don't have to provide any health insurance, health benefits, and it's great for their business model. Again, the other piece is if they're working within corporations or for-profit companies, how are they focusing on not just doing good, but making sure the organization doesn't do any harm? So it's a systemic piece, right? There's that systemic piece where the mindset is having this higher level of consciousness to understand that there's a broader part of this world, and it's not so focused on it. So there is that social justice piece. It's figuring out how we're going to be launching a class focused essentially on what is social justice and how can and essentially mindset and framework shifting or developing. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question fully. I know it's specifically on freelancers, but I think what I'm taking at is like there's a larger picture and there's a systemic and systems piece that has to be integrated into all of this. Yeah, and I think for the freelancer, one of the things we do is creating opportunities for freelancers to get skills, but part of it is exposing them, right? We get a lot of people in the for-profit space that want to hear about personal branding, and that's what I do. My personal branding workshop next week, on Monday, I think we have about 950 RSVPs. We'll get up to about 1,300, about 400 people will show up. The vast majority, which is an awesome workshop, you should definitely come. It's fun, it's super engaging. But the vast majority of people don't come with a social change lens. But when I introduce it to them, they walk out of there with a different framework. So same thing for freelancers. They're coming to Be Social Change to get to potentially biz dev opportunities or skill development, but then we shift them to expose them. There are opportunities for you to engage with nonprofits or social enterprises, not just these for-profit companies. So that's where we would do. There's specific, there's actually a couple startups that I know that are working specifically with freelancers. Obviously there's a freelancers union, but there's another one that's focused on self-care and a combination of like self-care, biz dev, as well as becoming socially conscious as a freelancer. So they're popping up. That just isn't our direct focus, but they can come in there to Be Social Change as part of it.
So, relatively simple question that is based on this previous conversation. How do you deal with greed, both systemic and on the individual level when you're talking about this? Because greed is really driving a lot of, let's just say, some of the negative impacts that the social entrepreneur is supposed to address comes about because people agree. I mean, it's a character trait within many of us, and
Yeah,
to
and
greater or lesser extent. So,
that's like I would love to get into a 20-hour conversation about that. I mean, I think, but you're starting to see this hit the mainstream, right? We're entering this new phase where I would say we're shifting. Again, there's this great book, Frederick Laloux, about reinventing organizations. And I think there's a shift globally, especially in the US, of consciousness. And I mean consciousness of being able to understand the world and the complexities in this growing divide between the wealthy and the not. I mean, it's popping up with Bernie Sanders, and he's out front and center talking about it more than and Elizabeth Warren really talking about it. And now I think the thing that's been interesting with the reason why he has such a growing campaign is because there's two things. One, this has been building, and people want to change that, and now there's the tools where people can take action at a certain level, right? But again, it's like this. I think the way that you think about it is there's changing the system, and you're chipping away at it. You're chipping away at it, and that's one thing. And then there's other things where you upend the system. And a lot of times, what you can do is you work, and I think we think about us in terms of a grassroots movement, is shifting mindsets that then as the years go on, their decisions multiplied and multiplied are going to have a systemic change effect. Then the other is supporting organizations that are actually directly creating that change. So that when people are going out in the world, it is mainstream, it is the norm. Oh, that's a B Corp, that's not a B Corp. On a most basic level, I can change, I can make an impact, and I wouldn't want people to think about it in that way because it's such a small decision. But I'll buy from this organization versus this organization. And those people eventually become, the greedy organizations or people eventually kind of get put out, or they're seen as not the norm. Yeah.
Which is exactly why I brought up Donald Trump and the Koch brothers, because there is a countervailing force.
Totally.
And libertarian or politically, socially conservative are powerful forces that are entrenched in their own way, and taking those kinds of things. The elections next year are not guaranteed, and whatever you have in Congress in terms of social welfare is going to help determine what's happening with any of this stuff as well.
Yeah,
and that's a part of the conversation I don't hear frequently because people don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, and I'll end with that in terms of creating meaning and purpose at work, right? And I think that's actually going to be one of the drivers. So you think about work before the Industrial Revolution, and work was meaningful and purposeful, and people don't even think about it because it was fully integrated. There was craftspeople, and you were farmers, and meaning and purpose was not separated. That's how work was. And then Adam Smith came, where it's only, and this isn't political, this is just pure history, is that Adam Smith came and we separated and created factories and took out the meaning in work. Yeah. So then it was just one thing. And we're kind of coming back to this desire for meaning and purpose. Now, independent of what political spectrum you're on, and I have fun arguments with this, is that, and I'm thinking about this more and more, is that to dismiss any political economic system, I think, is to miss its role in history. And capitalism and industrial revolution served a core function that had a lot of positives and a lot of negatives, right? And I think what's really interesting now is it's a lot of talk is, have we outlived that? That's the first thing. And what is that next phase of that political economic system? And more importantly, how can people be the drivers of that? So that's the interesting piece. And I agree, that needs to be integrated. I have to say that I owe that to my girlfriend, who comes from a social justice background and is heavily made me see the complexity systemically and what we're talking about that needs to be part of that conversation. Even if you're on whatever side, it needs to be part of this nonprofit social entrepreneurship, social innovation discussion. I'll give you just one little example of a lack of social consciousness. So there was a guy at Google that tweeted, I believe it was at Google, and a guy from Google, I think, responded. We'll just say a tech company because I can't verify that. But someone tweeted out and said, in my neighborhood in San Francisco, the last laundromat ended up leaving. So there's no laundromat within like however many blocks. It's impossible to do my laundry. And someone replied from a tech company saying, that's the price of disruption. Just use Handy. And Handy's like, I think Handy is the name, is like this delivery service. The vast majority of people that are low socioeconomic backgrounds in that area are not going to use Handy. So there's a lack of empathy and compassion and humility, especially in Silicon Valley, that needs to be part of this conversation. And I think we're all part of the drivers in that, and our responsibility to be able to do that. Great. Interesting. Yeah. Oh, I had a whole week-long conversation about that this week. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming and an amazing conversation. If you need to email me, feel free to email me at marcus@besocialchange.com. And it's .com. We have the .org as our website, but it's .com on the email. Thank you.